Hello there, good afternoon to you. If you're just joining me here at LBC, I want to talk about cladding again and fire safety. The Fire Safety Bill is back in the House of Commons today. The Grenfell United group say that the government is using the excuse that an amendment from the House of Lords will delay Grenfell recommendations. They argue, Grenfell United Group argue that the amendment is to protect leaseholders from charges. And at the same time as this fire safety bill is back in the Commons, Rachael Venables, LBC's correspondent, who's kept such a close eye on this story and the issues that flow from it, has an exclusive report about loans, cladding loans. So let's go straight to Rachael. Bring us up to speed on both of those elements of this story, Rachael, because they're separate but very much connected.
Absolutely, Sheila. And I think they're two disparate parts of this crisis, which is ongoing and which is growing more and more politically confusing and more politically damaging, I think, for the government as they scramble to try to get a grip of this scandal. I'll start first with the story that we broke on LBC this morning, which is that it could be years, I understand, before the loan scheme to remove flammable cladding from low-rise buildings could be brought in England, with many victims of the crisis fearing bankruptcy in the meantime. Now, these loans were announced by the government just over 11 weeks ago at the start of February as their real keystone solution to the crisis for anybody in medium-rise, low-rise buildings below 18 metres who had dangerous cladding. The government was offering up a loan system whereby money would be provided up front to remove the dangerous cladding, and then it would be paid back by individual flat owners or leaseholders over a long term. So these loans, it might take years, decades even to pay them back, but they'd be capped at £50 a month. And this was something the government was prepared to put billions into, they said, to try and fix the crisis, to protect people from bankruptcy. Now, I should say, first of all, cladding campaigners, leaseholders, you talk to really any of them, they are furious with this suggestion because there are a number of issues. They only cover cladding. This money wouldn't be used to remove, for example, flammable insulation or fix other defects. They'd also be held against the value of the property, many people say. And also there is that key overriding argument at the heart of all of this of whether or not leaseholders should actually have to pay anything. Should they have to pay a single penny to make these buildings safe? Now, the loan system, as I mentioned already, unpopular, but for some people, it is their only hope. It is all that stands between them and financial ruin and bankruptcy, which is why this story is so significant. As I've understood that during a meeting last week between housing officials and cladding campaigners, it was revealed that the government plans to introduce this loan scheme through legislation called the Building Safety Bill. Now, this bill is already long overdue. Many people think it could take at least a year, if not more, to bring it through. And that means in the meantime, people will be waiting for even that morsel of support. Now, Giles Grover is a campaigner. He was in this meeting and he told me that for some, it's already too late.
We're seeing people across the country that are getting bills right now. People in under 18 metres buildings. One recently got a bill for about £78,000 to be paid within 6 months. We're also seeing managing agents writing on their letters to leaseholders saying you need to pay these bills because the government hasn't yet actually come forth with details of the loan scheme. So what's really concerning is we asked what the timescales are, and they said the plan is to implement it along the Building Safety Bill, which, as we understand it, it's going to be a couple of years before that even comes in.
So we've been speaking to a number of people affected by this. As I mentioned, people who aren't happy with loans being their only option, but who are even more unhappy with the thought that they'd have to wait a long time for them to come in. And Zoe lives in a one-bed flat in Chelmsford. Her first baby is actually due in the summer, and she spoke to Nick Ferrari this morning. It is clear she's not sure if she can wait that long for this support.
I mean, it leaves us in a really quite stressful situation. Either our building remains unsafe for years whilst we await for these loans that might come into play, or once the remediation bill lands, I'm made bankrupt, and it's one of those two options: either I stay in unsafe housing for years and years and years while we wait for loans, or I'm financially ruined by a remediation bill that lands before the loans do.
Now, the Ministry of Housing says that these claims are misleading. They say they're working as quickly as possible to launch the scheme and that they'll publish more details in due course. But Sheila, LBC's report was actually picked up and mentioned in the House of Commons this afternoon by the Shadow Home Office Minister, Sarah Jones, as part of the fire safety debate, which is another key piece of legislation post-Grenfell that the government have been working on. And it also is taking an extraordinary long time to pass.
They don't seem to care that the vague and undefined loan scheme that they've hailed as the answer, despite having promised many times that leaseholders won't have to pay, will damage people's property prices and won't actually be in place, we hear today, for at least 2 years, leaving thousands to pay mountain waking watch bills and stuck in properties they can't sell.
Now, Sheila, let's turn properly to the fire safety bill, which you and I have discussed on a number of occasions and which has been on an incredible journey whereby it has bounced between the House of Commons and the House of Lords a number of times now, with Lords continually adding amendments to this piece of legislation that the government says is really important. They say it will save lives and strengthen regulations post-Grenfell. But the problem is the Lords keep adding amendments which are supported by opposition MPs and a growing number of Tory rebel MPs as well, that would protect leaseholders from having to pay to remove things like flammable cladding from their buildings. And this is a battle which is just going from one side to the other as the bill sort of really starts to struggle. Chris Pincher is one of the ministers from the Department for Housing, and he opened this debate, the fire safety bill debate, which is back in the Commons today, just a little bit earlier, and he really stressed how important it is that it is passed as soon as possible.
If we do not resolve this bill this week, fire risk assessments will not cover those critical elements of which I spoke, and they may continue, therefore, to be ignored by less responsible building owners. Moreover, the fire and rescue services will be without the legal certainty that they need to take enforcement action. Ultimately, that will compromise the safety of many people living in multi-occupied residential buildings.
And the passage of it through the Commons, I mean, it's been complex, but it's been incredibly emotional as well, hasn't it, Rachel? Because, and I want to hear from people about the impact this is having on their lives, because for many people, this is life-altering, life-shattering even.
It is a really emotive subject, and you can hear that. I've been listening to the debate started at about 2:30, so I've been listening to some of what the MPs have been saying, and they talk about really emotional, life-shattering sums of money. You've had at these debates before MPs waving pieces of paper which are cladding bills on them, up to, I think one of them was beyond £70,000. We also had one of the Tory MPs who's actually a sort of Tory rebel in all of this, Royston Smith, the Conservative MP for Southampton. And he took to his feet in the House of Commons earlier, and he talked about how a building in his constituency recently had a fire, and this building has got ACM cladding on it, which is the same as what was on Grenfell. And he talked about how would we feel, what would the reaction be if the fire service hadn't on this occasion been able to act, if lives hadn't been saved. And I think that's what's at stake here. It's people's finances, it's their property, but it is also life. This is a building safety crisis at its heart, and what we have are two very conflicting arguments and points of view. The government trying to push this forward, and as I mentioned, rebel Tory MPs, oppositions, and incredibly the House of Lords really saying that they won't allow the legislation to pass easily unless there is this added provision in place that protects leaseholders and their finances.
Thanks, Rachel. Rachael Venables, LBC's correspondent on this. Listening to all of that was Martin Boyd, chair of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership. Martin, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
In a sea of concerns, what's your priority at this point?
Hopefully the Parliament will support the Lord's amendment. If not, we just continue this ping pong, which is utterly ridiculous. We've got a government saying nearly 4 years after Grenfell, that it's urgent to pass this bill. Well, they should have done something 4 years ago.
And when people look at where the liability for this fire safety is landing, what are your thoughts? What would you say to those who think it's just tough luck?
Well, the the problem is, from day one, government has been aware and has repeatedly said that this is not in any way the fault of the people who bought these flats. There is no way that you could ever know that you were buying a dangerous flat before Grenfell. And they are also aware that the law makes it almost impossible to sue anyone for the fact that you now live in one of these unsafe buildings. So we have the government saying it's definitely not the fault of the leaseholders and the developers should do the right thing. But instead they're now passing a law which will make sure the exact opposite happens.
So what next then for you and other campaigners?
Well, the fire safety bill will presumably continue to bounce between the Lords and the Commons, and normally the accusation is if the Lords continue to press a point that they're being undemocratic. But the reality is, we have everyone from Grenfell United through to Conservative MPs saying this is a bad bill, and the government has just not listened.
And I mean, it has gone back and forth a lot, hasn't it, for attempts at change? Why do you think the government isn't listening, given that it has said, as you've described, people shouldn't be held responsible?
It's difficult to know. I mean, what has been very clear is that at no point have the government sought to engage with anyone about a possible alternative. They've basically just sat in an ivory tower and said, you will agree to this bill or else.
Well, thank you, Martin. I'm sure we'll talk again. Martin Boyd, Chair of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership. If you don't want to give your real name, you don't have to. I'm saying that. I suspect none of you will take me up on the offer, but I'm saying it just in case it's all a bit overwhelming for you, what you're facing in relation to cladding and the costs of fire safety issues that have emerged in your building. Alex is called from Ipswich. Hello, Alex.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Yeah, you are from a cladding campaign group.
I am. It's Ipswich Cladiators, and we are supporting leaseholders affected by the cladding scandal here in Ipswich.
Well, first things first, can I take my hat off to you for the name of the group?
Thank you very much.
that you could have a sense of humour in the midst of it is impressive. So tell me what you and others are facing.
Okay, we are facing high remediation costs for cladding and so many other fire safety defects, including unsafe insulation, timber balconies, and compartmentation issues as well.
And what have you been told about the likelihood of someone taking responsibility for this?
So far, we only know that our cladding remediation costs will be covered by government funding due to the fact that we live in a building above 18 metres.
Okay.
All the other fire safety defects I mentioned will not be covered by the government funding.
So what does this leave you facing?
It leaves me potentially facing bankruptcy due to the high costs and the fact that the government simply won't listen to our calls and our cries for help.
So who has supported you, Alex, in this?
Actually, our local MP, Tom Hunt, has been very supportive.
Yeah.
And so shout out to Tom Hunt, who's a Conservative backbencher. And there has been many other MPs around the country who have been supporting us, but unfortunately, today there won't be enough to win the vote on the amendment.
So where is this leaving you and others then, financially?
Financially, we're in a position where we could lose our homes. We could have the history of having bankruptcy on our names for the rest of our lives through no fault of our own.
Yeah. And what's this doing to you?
It is so stressful. And to be honest, I have contacted my local GP for stress-related reasons.
Mm. And is that common in the group?
It must be, yeah. there was a survey done recently that shows that almost a quarter of us have considered suicide or other mental health impacts.
Well, listen, I wish you well, Alex. We'll keep looking at the subject and do keep in touch with us as well. Alex in Ipswich, who, along with others, has formed a cladding campaign group. Gisla's called from Hornchurch. Gisla, hello.
Hi, it's Ghazala.
Ghazala, apologies.
That's okay. I bought a property as an investment up in Sheffield for my pension, and just recently, same with everyone else, got a cladding issue. They removed the cladding, and we first were told that no one's going to pay for that. We have to pay. We're talking about Waking Watch, the fire safety, and they're saying bills of £80,000. I believe the government has now said they will pay, because it's 18 metre, above 18 metre tall, they will pay the remedial. We've been told, but we don't know. They keep changing their minds. And I really think that it should be the freeholders, people who built buildings. It should be the council who passed the laws, the building to be safe. I bought it about 10 years ago, over 10 years ago, and I don't see why we, the leaseholders, should have to foot the bill.
And is that £80,000 for each owner in your building?
Each owner. Owner.
That's a lot of money, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it's just something, and there's people who's actually their homes, they actually live there, that's their own home and things, and they're really upset. And obviously, this was for my pension for the future, that I had bought it as an investment. But now... And
do you rent it out to somebody currently?
Yes, but we can't sell. We can't. I mean, at the moment, I'm lucky it's rented out, but there are people that haven't got, can't get tenants in there. They can't sell it. Can't get out of it because of this hanging over us. So it's actually worthless. So that's what we've been told. The buildings, it's like taking out another mortgage, really, on top of the mortgage that we've got. It's like taking an extra mortgage out.
And this rather damages your
having sleepless nights over this.
Well, your health, yes, but your pension plan,
yeah, it's really very, very stressful for all concerned, really. And I don't see that why we, the leaseholders, should be paying for it. It should be the freeholders, or like I said, people who pass these buildings to be safe. They should have some.
Just natural justice would suggest that the developers and the landowners, who develop these buildings so that people like you would come and buy them, surely they have a greater responsibility than they seem to be prepared to stump up yet.
Yeah, and I know that I'm not alone, and we've all, lots of these groups going, and but there's lots of properties in Sheffield. I'm not one of those. There's so many buildings in Sheffield that are affected really badly. We've written to our MPs, trying to get support to people to help us to sort this, resolve this. But it's a nightmare, really.
Well, thank you, Ghazala, for your call. And, we're, like I say, we're following every development in this and seeing if there is a handbrake turn at any point that helps people like you. But it is incredibly difficult. And both Ghazala and our previous caller as well, talking about the stress on them. If you're living with this, tell me what it is you're living with and how you're managing to live with it. This huge financial sort of sword of Damocles hanging over you. Let me just read a few more of your texts here. Our blocks are under 18 metres and have failed cladding around our lift shafts. Our Labour Council had granted the freeholder planning permission to build 5 more flats on top of our building, while we're 9 months into leaseholders not being able to sell or remortgage. We're waiting for our bills to start coming in, says this text. A lot of stress. That's from Nick in southwest London, while the freeholder will make £1 million profit off the new flats, says Nick. That's just one text. Let me read a couple more. Do get your calls in as well, 0345 606 0973. If you're affected directly by the cladding/fire safety issues, I'd love to hear from you. And who do you say should pay when people find themselves in dangerous, not properly regulated, unsellable flats. 0345 6060 973. This text says, I don't understand why this is even a question after all these years. The fault solely lies with those who signed off the papers for the flammable materials to be used. I would say hear to that. The idea that the residents could even be considered to pay is unfathomable. That's from Nura. I would agree with you, Nura. I think signing off on the cladding being used, and I would also say that the government has to look at its fire safety regulations, our fire safety regulations, and see whether they have any responsibility for not doing that properly. Phil says on cladding, it has to be the developers or suppliers that pay. If I buy a car and 4 years later there's a safety critical issue and a recall, then the manufacturer takes it back and rectifies it. The same principle should apply, says Phil. Well, I agree with all of those, so thank you very much for that. Georgie is called from Wandsworth. Hello, Georgie.
Hello, hi.
You're caught up in this cladding and fire safety story. How?
So I was a first-time buyer and I bought a flat about 10 years ago now. And unfortunately, we've recently found out that we don't actually have aluminium cladding, but we have a number of other issues relating to our fire break spacing and our insulation. So we're currently in the process of trying to apply to the government funding, but obviously we're unsure of how the government are going to view this, because they've been very specific in the fact that they're only going to be covering cladding specifically. So we've got a whole load of uncertainty. We don't know what financially costs we're going to have to cough up, essentially, money that we don't have. And not to mention the fact that now our insurance has gone up 146%. And we're now paying £6,000 a year to live in an unsafe building, and that's purely just everyday running costs of that.
And what is that? That's your service charge has increased that much?
Yeah. So because of the insurance increase for the block itself, that has obviously meant that our service charges have gone up 146%.
God.
Yeah. So it's unsustainable.
Yes.
And it's stressful.
And even if the government loan scheme, which applies to cladding, even if it were applied to wider issues, does that seem fair to you that you might have the rest of your life to pay, but it's still you paying?
Why should I have to take out it's essentially a second mortgage. You know, it's not sustainable for people, and in reality, you're taking out a whole run of the property ladder in reality, because if you think about it, the majority of these people that live in these flats are either first-time buyers or, you know, it's the bottom run of the property ladder in reality, and you're asking someone that's saved so hard in order to get this first property that now, no, sorry, we're lending this money, but you're going to have to pay it back for something that's not fundamentally our fault. You know, we did all the right things. It's, in my opinion, construction companies that should be paying for this. And not the taxpayer.
And not just doing the right thing. I mean, in a sense, young people in particular were answering the call of the government, weren't they? Don't hold back. You can be homeowners. You can do it this way, that way, the other way. So there was government encouragement as well.
And now the government have just pulled the rug out from under us and said, oh, sorry, you know, you did all the right things, but it doesn't apply to construction companies that have done the wrong thing. And they're making multi-million pounds a year. No, I'm not.
And is your freeholder a property development company, an individual?
Yeah.
Do you know? It's a property development company.
Development company.
And will they engage with you?
No, wash their hands of it completely. They have ignored all of our correspondence and have just basically said, no, it's not our problem. Which is it opens a whole can of worms in relation to leasehold.
Well, it makes you wonder as well. I'd love to know the detail.
Scandal.
Well, it makes you wonder the kind of, and I may be being overly suspicious here, but it makes you wonder the kind of deals that property developers are reaching with the government on this.
Yeah.
I wonder how many of them have been texting the housing minister or the prime minister. I don't know.
I know
whether they have those connections. Really. I don't know.
If you look at the biggest funding donations to the Conservative Party, it might correlate in some way.
We're on it, Georgie. We're on it. We're on it.
Yeah, well, thank you for having the conversation.
Well, thank you.
It needs to be kept in the limelight.
Well, we will continue to have it. So do keep in touch with us. Georgie in Wandsworth, thank you. I wish you well. Lots of texts coming in on this as well as your calls. The cladding was signed off as compliant with building regulations because they were. Now the government has changed the regulations and made the change retrospective in effect. That never happens. It shows the law was wrong. The government is liable because they didn't change the law when they knew it was wrong regarding building regulations, says this texter. Laura's called from Tooting. You're a leaseholder affected by this.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Thanks for taking my call.
My pleasure. What's your situation then?
So I'm in a building that was built in 2011, and I bought my leasehold flat about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
At the time, I did all kind of, the due diligence you do when you're buying. Obviously, first-time buyers, I didn't really know the ins and outs, but one thing I did check was the NHBC certificate to say that the building has been signed off as compliant with building regulations. And so, obviously, that was fine. And obviously accepted that I had a service charge to pay for, wear and tear of the building. It's kind of what the leasehold laws are, basically. Yeah. Like if something happened to the roof or whatever, you might have to pay for that. But what obviously I didn't expect to have to pay is for a defect in a building that didn't meet regulations at the time. We've had a survey done.
That's a different thing, isn't it, than the slates on the roof needing replacing or the brickwork needing doing or something,
Yeah, and we had a survey done, after the new government regulations came out. And it's like the opinion of the freeholder and our managing agent and the solicitors we've spoken to that the building didn't actually meet the regulations at the time it was built. And we've been fighting this whole year to get NHBC to accept that, and they still won't accept that. I mean, they haven't said no, but they haven't said yes either. And, in the meantime, we're just kind of completely in limbo, waiting for somebody to help us out, because although we haven't had the bills coming in that other people have, and some of those stories are awful, our lives are on hold. My flat is worth nothing. I can't sell it. And actually, I probably can't even rent it out.
Because people might be nervous of the safety element.
Yeah, and, to change my mortgage conditions. So, I've got a mortgage on this. And if I know people in the building who've tried to remortgage and they're not able to remortgage onto, they have to go onto the standard rate, like variable mortgage, because no mortgage companies will actually remortgage on these flats because we don't have the certificate to say they're safe, even though when we bought we did. But the conditions have been changed. And, on top of that, the building's still under the NHBC warranty, which then turned out to be worthless. It's a 10-year warranty you get for new buildings. And we're saying, well, surely that should cover a defect at the time of build, and they still won't accept liability for that either.
And how is this affecting you, your health, your mental health?
It's pretty awful, actually. I'm a director on the board for the building, and I took that up because I feel so passionately that this is wrong, and that actually I shouldn't even have to know about any of this stuff, but I spend hours and hours a week. It's really quite consuming. Like today, I couldn't concentrate on the work that I'm supposed to be doing. I've got a full-time job because I was so distracted by what's going on in Parliament, just hoping and praying that the MPs would do the right thing. And obviously some of them tried to, but it's all consuming. It really, really is.
And to go back to the first call I had, it does seem, doesn't it, that the government has made all the right noises about helping you and all the right noises about where liability should lie, but then is acting in a different way.
Yeah, and I think that's the worst part. I mean, in a way, I'd respect them a lot more if they just said, actually, we don't have to solve this. You're just going to have to pay. As much as I'd be so angry about that, at least we know that is, I mean, that's what they're doing. They're not actually helping us out at all. And, we've applied to the Building Safety Fund. Our building, in my opinion, meets every single one of the criteria to get the funding, and yet we still haven't heard back from them. We chase them continuously. They've been asking us to prove several times how tall our building is, because the plans indicate there's under 18 metres, but it's been measured several times and it's over 18 metres.
Can't be that difficult to measure a building, can it?
You would have thought not, but they've asked us to prove it 3 times. So we've had to pay as leaseholders for surveys to prove to the Building Safety Fund that our building meets the criteria that they've set. So we're actually in the position where we should be getting government funding, and they still haven't paid it. So they say in public, we've put this £5 billion funding aside, but actually we're eligible for it and we still don't have it.
And to be clear, that's not about cladding.
That is about cladding.
That is about cladding in your case,
yes.
right? But is this
so we've got flammable cladding, yeah.
But is this still money that you would then have to pay off in the form of a loan?
So if they rule that our building meets the building safety criteria, so our building
the measuring problem. Yeah.
The measuring. So if they say, okay, yes, we accept the measurement, then in theory we should get the funding. If they say, actually, no, you've fallen below by a few centimetres, then we'll be forced with these loans. And it is literally a matter. In our case, we think we're 7 centimetres over, and they don't. So it's literally, 7 centimetres between bankruptcy and or a loan, or having all the funding, which is absolute madness.
Well, I wish you well, Laura. Laura in Tooting, thank you. And it must be hard to be, you're dealing with it for the group, for your neighbours, but you're at the heart of it as well. It's not an easy position to find yourself in. Rachael Venables has just tweeted that the latest Lord's amendment to try to protect flat owners from cladding costs has been defeated again by 320 votes to 256. So a majority of 64. This is in the House of Commons. So it's going to go right back to the Lords again. The government majority has been halved. So it looks as though more and more Tory MPs are unhappy, which again, if Steve from earlier in the programme is still listening, who said he doesn't bother voting and he doesn't feel he has any influence, it's not easy to get influence and to push into the corridors of power. Of course it's not easy. But those Tory MPs are unhappy because their constituents have made it clear that they are unhappy or harmed by this. And it is worth lobbying your MP. It is worth calling for help from your MP. And that's why it is also worth voting. So that was just my little speech in the middle of that. But 31 Conservative MPs voted for the amendment to protect leaseholders from being passed the cladding costs. 320 voted against it. It looks like 9 Tory MPs have abstained, including Felicity Buchan, in whose constituency Grenfell Tower stands still.